Hey everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to tune back into the Tattoos with Intention podcast. I'm your host, Mark Nara, and I just quickly want to say a big thank you. I really appreciate everyone's feedback from episode 1. I've been blown away with the positive response. It was received really well, and it's definitely fueling me to create some more significant content for you. I'm really excited to be able to share this next interview. Our guest is Deter-Wolf. He's a prehistoric archaeologist with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology and an adjunct professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Middle Tennessee State University. He earned his master's while studying Maya archaeology before transitioning to work as a professional archaeologist in the American Southeast. While his day-to-day work focuses predominantly on Native American ancient sites in Tennessee, for the past decade he's been a leading researcher into the archaeological footprint of tattooing. That work has included efforts using contextual analysis and microscopic use-wear signatures to identify tattoo tools, and experiments recreating and testing these ancient tattoo implements, including on himself. In 2009, Aaron organized the first American academic symposium to examine ancient and early historic Native American tattooing, which culminated in the volume Drawing with Great Needles, Ancient Tattoo Traditions of North America. Since that time, he's participated in international symposias on ancient body modification and authored book chapters on the identification of ancient tattoo tools and the origins of tattooing. In 2016, Aaron was the lead author on an article confirming that the European ice mummy Utsi exhibits the world's oldest preserved tattoos, and that same year appeared in the Nova documentary Iceman Reborn. Aaron is co-editor of the new volume Ancient Ink, The Archaeology of Tattooing, the first ever book dedicated to the global archaeological study of tattooing. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Thanks for joining me. Really good to have you on here, man.
I'm pleased to be here.
So it's Aaron Deter-Wolf. That's the full name?
That is correct.
What's the background? What's your heritage?
All over the place, man. It's,
yeah.
I have hippie parents, and I got the hyphenated name when they had kids, and my brother got the same, and so yeah, we got a little bit of German, a little bit of French, a little bit of Alsatian, back through the Russian line.
Yeah, cool.
We all end up the same when we go back far enough, right? That's
totally. I mean, I agree with that for sure. Man, I just did the hyphenated name with our daughter because we couldn't decide which way to go.
Right on. Yeah.
Hippie parents, man. That's funny. Yeah. So, give us a brief background about yourself. You know what it is you do exactly, and.
Yeah, so my day job, I am one of 2 prehistoric archaeologists for the state of Tennessee Division of Archaeology, and we have about 33,000 recorded archaeological sites in the state of Tennessee, and my office is responsible for a whole bunch of different things. Developers regarding archaeological sites, managing sites on state-owned lands, conducting research, teaching the public about archaeology. And my own focus as a prehistoric guy is on ancient Native American sites. And so broadly, that's the eastern woodlands of North America. So everything east of the Mississippi River. And then more specifically, since I'm in Tennessee, I focus on what we call the American Southeast. So pretty much, Virginia, Kentucky, over west to the Mississippi, and then down through the Florida Panhandle.
Wow. That's a pretty big area to cover.
It is, but because I'm working for the state, we of course the boundaries didn't exist prehistorically, right? There were no state boundaries or political boundaries as we think of them today.
Correct.
And so archaeologically, people didn't really care what we think, where we think Tennessee should end and Kentucky should begin, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're focusing on Tennessee, but that work then has repercussions for how we understand sites in other states and sites in other regions. And so we're constantly sort of, working out of our home areas to try to learn more and try to help each other out.
Right. And so when like a region sort of crosses over into a different state, like a tribal region does, are you then working with the archaeologists across that border?
not directly, but just in terms of sharing information,
Yeah.
so we're all presenting our information at conferences and publishing it and doing things like this. And that's actually one of the interesting things about the work that I'm doing is that the period I'm working with is from when the first people arrive in Tennessee, so the end of the last ice age, let's say 14,000 years ago or so, up until the first Europeans arrive. And here in Tennessee, that's around 1525 or so. And so these people are ancient. They're ancient Native American, but we don't know what their tribal heritage is. So the tribes that we know of today, the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and these other groups, they form after the archaeological societies of the region sort of collapse, beginning in the 13 and 1400s AD. And so we know that these people are ancestral to the modern tribes, but we can't look at a specific site from, say, 5,000 years ago and say these people were Cherokee or these people were Shawnee. Instead, we just know them as ancient Native American.
Yeah, okay. And so do you have an idea of when that collapse was prior to those groups forming?
Yeah, we have some really interesting archaeological stuff that happens here. So, as an example, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, right?
Yeah.
Home of country music. And but before Nashville was a city, there were at around 1100 AD through about 1300 AD, there were thousands of Native Americans living here in these mound cities, right? They're building earthen mounds, putting their houses and their temples up on top of these mounds. And there were just thousands and thousands of these people living here. It was a city before it was Nashville. But starting about 12 or 1300 AD, we get some really interesting things going on with the archaeological record where there seems to be a period of drought lasting for several generations.
Right.
And at around that time, then things start to go wrong. There's a real uptick in like interpersonal violence. So like skeletons showing evidence of being attacked or of defending themselves. A lot of instances of malnutrition. Right.
Yeah.
So women showing anemia or malnutrition, and then those deficiencies being passed down to children. And so this kind of becomes a multi-generational problem. And right on the heels of that, starting about 1400 AD, the area just seems to empty out. It seems like everybody just kind of has it up to here with the thing and goes elsewhere. And from that point on, here in this region of Middle Tennessee, it's a shared hunting ground for a bunch of Native Americans, but no one is living here on a year-round basis until after the European settlers show up, beginning in the 15 and 1600s.
Okay. Wow, man.
So yeah, now you know everything you need to know about Tennessee archaeology.
Tennessee. There you go. Wow, I mean, that's super interesting. I'd never sort of drawn that correlation of the people prior to those groups had formed, like the Cherokee and the rest of it. That's super interesting. Yeah. Like, what's the mix, like genealogy wise?
Well, so you just as far as genetics go, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, we don't actually know. So there's, because of the requests and requirements of federally recognized tribal groups, we don't do destructive analysis on ancient Native American skeletons.
Yeah.
So it's fairly rare that we can actually extract genetic material from these skeletons and run the DNA. And it's even rarer than that there are living Native Americans who are willing to contribute their DNA to those studies.
Yeah.
This is something they believe very strongly, that, so much was taken from them historically that this is one more thing that we shouldn't muck with.
Yeah.
And,
I mean,
we respect that. Yeah.
Yeah. That's such an interesting area of your work that I wanted to ask about is, permission, like who's giving you permission to work in these areas? Like, obviously it's the state giving you permission, but then is there another layer to it? Are you getting permission from the cultural groups? Are you getting cultural permission? And what steps do you have to take? How's that been?
It depends on where you're working. I mean, even within the state, right, there's all these different levels of where a site is. So there may be state level oversight. If there's funding or permitting coming through from the federal government. So for instance, let's say they're building a highway or a transmission line. Then there's this whole other level of thing that happens at a federal level. And it's at the federal level that it usually cues then consultation with tribal groups.
Okay.
And so it's during that process then that you'll actually reach out to tribal entities. They oftentimes will have say as far as how sites are worked with, or what level of investigation, and particularly when human remains are concerned.
Yeah, of course. It's and I mean, I don't suppose that they would necessarily see any like benefit on their part from the investigation, right?
I think it depends.
Like, is there
We try
any
to.
like reciprocity in that process? Are they gaining stuff from the research as well for their people, or?
They're certainly learning, and that's
Yeah,
something I think the new generation of archaeologists is really trying hard to do, is to get past that old, like, it belongs in a museum sort of
yeah,
Indiana Jones thing, and sort of move into this area where where we're all learning together. Whether we're archaeologists or Native Americans or just some guy on the street, we can all learn about the past together.
yeah,
And so we're trying really hard to do that kind of outreach today.
yeah. So that's your focus, and you're like approaching it more like sensitively, I guess, which is
Absolutely, and
which is
and
great.
that sort of ties into, I feel like, this the tattooing work that I've been doing, that sort of research. So I got interested in this idea of ancient tattooing because of my work here in Tennessee, because of the archaeological work. And so if you go back into the historical record from like the 15 and 1600s, shortly after the first Europeans arrive, whether it's in Florida or whether it's the Plymouth colonies in Massachusetts, or whether it's California or Mexico, wherever it is, you have these historical accounts of Europeans talking about their first impressions of the native peoples of the New World, and almost without exception, they describe these people as being tattooed.
Yeah, right.
And and that's sort of hidden in the literature because Captain Cook hadn't been to the Pacific yet, so no one was using the word tattoo,
Yeah, it didn't
right? So
exist till
yeah,
1770. Right.
right. So they may be saying, they engrave their bodies, or they're describing it. They say, they prick the skin with needles and rub in pigment, and then the design will never fade. But you read that with modern eyes, and you're like, well, they're clearly talking about tattooing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that got me interested as an archaeologist then, with like this idea that if we know something is happening, we know this behavior is going on, well, then why aren't we finding it archaeologically? Because prior to about a decade ago, there have been millions of artifacts discovered and analyzed and excavated from millions of sites across North America. And there were maybe a dozen or so cases where someone had said, this tool is a tattoo implement.
Okay.
And so when you look at like the density of the practice historically versus the lack of artifacts,
Doesn't
that
match
really
up.
started to bug me. Right.
Yeah.
As someone with tattoos, that started to bug me, right?
Yeah. So like tattooing was quite like very dense. Everyone was getting tattooed. It was just commonplace from the recounts that we have.
Yeah, virtually every Native American society, it seems like, was practicing tattooing for different reasons depending on the society, but just about everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
And so then my question archaeologically is, well, where are the tools? And so this sort of set me on this, what sort of ended up being a decade-long or so research project at this point, trying to figure out, well, where are the tools?
Yeah, yeah.
And it sort of blew up from there because then I realized that this is a worldwide problem. That at pretty much anywhere you go on the world, you have this exact same process where we know that people were tattooing in antiquity, but there are very few archaeological identifications of the tools.
Yeah.
And so there's this question,
Yeah.
right, of like, why? Why are we missing them? Well, maybe they're biodegradable. If they're using thorns to tattoo, well, the thorn's not going to survive for 5,000 years in the dirt, right? But maybe people just weren't looking for them.
Yeah, maybe people weren't as exposed at the time of that research to tattooing. Like tattooing's pretty commonplace now, but maybe a couple of 300 years ago, not so much, right?
Not so much, and the people doing the research back then, I think, had a lot of biases against it.
Yeah,
that's one of the processes of this. People, more and more people becoming tattooed today, we're sort of shedding those biases. But yeah, you go back 100 years, and tattooing was something for like seamen and criminals and prostitutes, right?
Yeah.
And so scholars looking at the past weren't really looking for evidence of tattooing.
Yeah,
And it may
yeah.
have been right there in front of them. They just didn't care to see it.
Yeah, makes complete sense. They're like, oh, this is just a sharp chisel or a cutting implement or, you know, whatever they think, a
Exactly.
comb, right?
Yeah, and that's a problem with archaeology is that once you take that thing, right? Let's say a pointed bone, and you take it out of the archaeological record and you call it something and you say this is a needle, or this is an awl, or it's a hairpin, or a gaming token, right? That's what gets written down in the catalog, and so that is the only thing it will ever be. Whenever anybody goes back to look at that artifact, whether it's in a museum or whether it's in the research catalogs, they will see sewing needle as
Yeah,
that what that tool is.
yeah.
It may be something completely different, but it's hard to reconstruct that.
So you've obviously spent time then revisiting all the catalogs and I guess reverse engineering a lot of the categories.
We're
And
trying.
yeah, yeah,
Think about like bone tools, right? I mean, there are millions of these things that have been discovered just in Eastern North America alone, let alone all around the world.
What's a typical tattoo tool look like for the Tennessee region or one of the regions?
Well, so this is one of the things we're just figuring out, right? Is what these things actually look like, and this has been a process because that same bone tool, for example, it could reasonably be any of those things I just said. It could be a hairpin, it could be for working leather, and so a lot of my research that has been trying to figure out like how do we separate that, and for me, what this comes down to is use-wear. Is this idea that when you use a tool for something, it leaves behind this very distinctive microscopic pattern, right? So let's say you use a knife to cut wood off a tree, and then you use a different knife to butcher a carcass. You're going to get different microscopic wear patterns from those two activities.
Yeah.
And so by looking at those wear patterns, you can take the subjectivity out of it. And you can say, scientifically, this wear pattern means this tool was used for cutting wood or for chopping grasses. And so with bone tools, over the last decade, we've been figuring out what the wear pattern is for tattooing. What does it look like at a microscopic level when a bone tool is used to tattoo, as opposed to when a bone tool is used to like punch holes in leather for making clothes? And we're just figuring this out really in the last couple of years. We're really getting the hang of it. And so now all of a sudden we have this data. We have this data set where we can then look at the artifacts and say, oh, this particular bone tool from Tennessee. And I'm working on a couple of these right now from Tennessee, set of turkey bone tools. So they're the metatarsus of a turkey, of a
the metatarsus. Where's that? Is that like
it's lower leg bone?
Lower leg, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so they are sharpened into these pointy bone tools that had traditionally been called awls, like they were used for leather work. Yeah. And by looking at those microscopically, using these high-powered microscopes, we can get down to that microscopic wear pattern and look at it and say, the polish on these things only extends about 3 millimeters up from the tip. That's because they're very shallowly punching through wet hide, so fresh hide, right? Yeah. That's what tattooing is, right? We jam a pointy object very shallowly into fresh hide. Now, if you were using that same tool to like work leather, the wear patterns would go up about another 4 or 5 centimeters, and usually there's kind of a twist on the tip of them. For some reason, as humans, when we jam tools into leather, we tend to twist them.
Yeah, well, it's harder too. It's a lot harder surface to penetrate, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's all kinds of different like spalling and abrasions that happen then on leather that don't happen on flesh. And so now we are able to bring this to play, and it's just in the last year then that we've found these specific tools from Tennessee, and they're about probably 1600 to 3600 BC, somewhere in that range. And the wear patterns on them are consistent with tattooing.
Wow.
And they're from this assemblage that also has mixed in with it pigment materials.
Assemblage, is that like a bundle?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a group of artifacts that were all together, and some of them are stone tools, and some of them these turkey bones, and then some of them are freshwater shells, mussel shell, And in the cups of these mussel shell is red pigment residue.
Mm-hmm.
And under the microscope, we then found that some of that same red pigment residue is present on the tips of these tools.
Okay.
And so in addition to the polish, we now have the pigment. And so it
Wow.
looks like this was the pigment they were using to tattoo.
They were tattooing with red pigment.
It's interesting,
That's
right?
crazy. Yeah, yeah. I mean, most of the recounts that you see, either drawings or on mummies, it's always like these darker, blacky blue pigments.
It's always black work. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So to see
And
red, that's pretty unique. Do you have any? Do you have any human remains that have red markings on them that you found?
not from North America.
Right.
There are maybe some from South America, but just as appear in really old historic accounts, nothing that's like contemporaneous or that you can really hang your hat on.
Yeah, I mean,
most of the mummies are black work.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting, right? What is this red pigment doing there?
Yeah.
I think there's this whole other cultural thing happening with red pigments. I mean, we see this ethnographically, right? In some of these indigenous tattooing traditions around the world, people are tattooing with like oils. They're tattooing with things where it's the act of tattooing that's important.
Yeah, correct. I saw that in
Thailand.
Thailand. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that there may be something like that happening where, the substance itself is significant or the act of tattooing is significant.
Well, I mean, red pigments are super significant here in Australia.
Absolutely.
Red ochre's used in, I mean, I'm not an expert on the matter, but I know they use it a lot in their burial ceremonies. There's a lot of, they find even skeletons where the whole bones are just saturated with the red ochre pigment.
You find that all over the world.
Right.
There's, people, when they talk about, for example, the origins of language, don't quote me on this, but I think the color red is like maybe the third color term that humans develop. There's like black and then white and then red.
And blue was the last, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think blue's the last one they developed.
But I mean, how significant is red, right? It's blood, it's the sunrise, it's childbirth, it's all of these things. So yeah, all over the globe, you find exactly the same thing, right? Red ochre, red earth pigments that are used on, put onto artifacts, that are painted on bodies, that are painted on skeletons. Now, at the same time, on these same tools, there are some very small black residues.
Okay.
And they're so small that we haven't been able to sample them scientifically yet to see what their elemental makeup is. But I would bet that they were carbon.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
So, yeah.
Wow. Let's backtrack a sec. I want to ask you about, because when we're talking about these puncture marks in the skin, when I was doing my little bit of homework before I contacted you, I read the article where you tattooed yourself.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, because I'm pretty sure it was in relation to trying to figure out the puncture wear marks.
It was.
It's crazy, man. Crazy tattooing yourself.
Preface that by saying, how many people do you think have stick and pokes in this day and age, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But you're doing it on a whole nother level, right?
Well, I wouldn't say so, right? I mean, that's one of the things that I always tell people is that, I'm not a tattooist, right? I am an archaeologist that has some tattoos and an interest. And so, I'd never pretend to actually be able to like be an artist, right? But what happened here was we were looking for those use-wear patterns. And we've been using pigskin. And, okay. I mean, like every forensic TV show you've ever seen, right? They use pigskin for like gunshot wounds or bite marks or, things like this. It's a forensic science. And so we were using pigskin to test these wear patterns.
It's like an apprentice tattooist here, mate. They get the skin at the butcher.
Yeah, same thing. And then some genius, one of my friends, stopped and he said, well, there have been these studies that show that like penetration wounds on pig are about the same as they are on human, but no one's ever actually looked at whether microscopic wear patterns on a dead pig are the same as microscopic wear patterns you get when you tattoo a live human.
Okay.
So if we don't know that, then what good is our research, right? Like, we have to test that before we can know that we're actually doing valid science. And so it was, the easiest thing, right? I'm right-handed was, well, I've got a left wrist.
Yep.
So let's go ahead and do that thing.
And so what tool did you make? I love
So
making tattoo tools. I love it. I make little hand tools all the time. Get some bones.
Yeah, so I have this fixation on bone tools, right? Just because of my research.
Yeah.
And so it was white-tailed deer bone. So white-tailed deer here from Tennessee, lower leg bone. That then for all these tools, we recreated them authentically, right? So we split them using stone tools and then shaved them or braided them down into these sort of splinter bone awls. And so that's what I used for that. And good. It's amazingly effective.
Yeah. Where'd you get the bone from?
Oh, we just harvested it around. You know people that are hunters that have deer legs laying around, and you're like, hey man, you got a deer leg? Yeah, send it my way.
Wow.
So yeah, and one of the things that I discovered that I thought was really interesting was I expected those tools to get dull a lot quicker than they did.
Okay.
And so some other people now have done experiments. This guy, Christian Gates St. Pierre up in Montreal, he did an experiment using deer bone tools to tattoo pigskin as well. And they used those tools for, I think, upwards of an hour of solid work.
And it was still sharp.
No noticeable dullness in the tool.
Yeah, right.
And I expected to have to resharpen it regularly during that process, but it turns out that they work really, really well. And heal pretty quickly too, all things considered.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think especially working by hand opposed to a tattoo machine, you're doing a lot less trauma, especially if you first pass, you're getting it in deep enough and saturating it enough. You're actually doing less damage. So, you'd expect it to heal better, right?
Right. Well, and I've had some hand tapped work done as well.
Oh wow.
In Indonesia, Durga tattoo.
Yeah, I know Durga's work.
Yeah.
Great.
Durga did some hand tap stuff on me, and he was using a modern tattoo needle on his hand tap tool.
Yeah.
So it was steel needle but hand tapped. But yeah, man, I felt like that thing. I mean, like it shed no pigment. Like it was clean. I felt like it healed really quickly in sort of suboptimal conditions, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I've wondered too, is if there's a question of trauma, right? The number of times a tattoo machine hits your skin.
I think it's like 60. I think it's like 60 times a second with an average machine.
Yeah, as opposed to just tapping it in, tap.
Yeah.
Your skin's going to heal easier, I think.
Yeah. It's such a slippery slope for a modern tattooist who's learnt with machines. I really enjoy using the hand tools. The process is great. I really sort of align with it. But then the work that you're doing is so quick, and the aesthetic is just so seductive. You can't really achieve some of the same things with a hand tool. So
yeah, right on.
It's one of those lines I'm learning to walk and integrate both into the practice. But it's cool. Have you had any tattoos done by machine?
Yes. Yeah. I have a number of machine tattoos, and all my first ones, going back 20 years ago were all machine tattoos, and
nice.
Sort of found this belatedly, and it's, I think anytime you start doing work like this, right, it's going to kind of spiral. And so now all of a sudden, my number of tattoos starts growing exponentially as I start doing this research.
Yeah. What was the tattoo you did with the deer tool?
Well, so like I said, I'm right-handed, and I needed a surface that I could work on conveniently. And so what I did was
cool.
I just gave myself parallel lines on the back of my left wrist, which at the time I was working on a paper on Ötzi the Iceman.
Yeah.
Right. The ice mummy from the Tyrol region there in Italy and Austria.
And Alps,
he has these same lines on his left wrist. And so I figured, I was working on a paper, I was working on a bone needle thing. I just go ahead and do 2 lines on the left wrist where I could see what I was doing and do it nice and easy.
Nice.
And,
how's the arthritis now? Gone?
Oh, it's totally fixed.
Yeah. See, medicinal, right? That's good.
That's right.
Cool, man. That's really cool. So another question on I guess the permission side of things and the cultural aspect, working with these people on their land, what role have you had with them? Have you been in relation with anyone, and how does it feel working so heavily as an outsider in their areas, and how do you work around that? And
Yeah, that's a tough thing. And sort of big picture, right? I mean, that is anthropology as a science, right?
right,
Anthropologists come in as outsiders and study cultures which they don't belong to.
yeah,
And on paper, that gives us an objectivity where we're able to to escape all of these sort of inner workings of the culture. You're supposed to be this impartial third party observer. And so I believe in that, right? I believe in the idea that as an outsider that you can see things differently than if you're a part of the culture. Now, that doesn't mean you're seeing them better, and it doesn't mean what you're seeing is right. There is no right and wrong in culture. Culture is culture. It's just a different viewpoint. And so that again, over the last decade or so, has been a really important thing about doing anthropology of any type, is bringing in those indigenous viewpoints. And sort of trying to work to meld those two together. And so, like, for example, with this tattooing stuff, I mean, it's cool, right? So we can wave our hands around and be like, oh, people are tattooing 5,000 years ago, woo! But on a functional level, right, then this is demonstrating that, these traditions that were practiced by Native Americans until European arrival, right? These are things that were stomped out by colonialism, along with,
right,
certain native languages and how you dress. Tattooing is one of the first things to go. Those traditions aren't just important, they're 5,000 years old, right? So you demonstrate this continuity of culture going back 5,000 years. And I feel like that really, for me, affirms that the people we're talking about in the past are real people, right? They have agency, they have creativity. They're conceiving of the world in these creative ways, and have ritual and belief. And I know that seems weird to say out loud a little bit, but when you get back to a certain point in the past, the tradition has been, those people were foragers, they were hunter-gatherers. And scholars for decades tended to just sort of wave their hands at hunter-gatherers and say, oh, well, they lived a more simple existence out in the forest, right? They moved around and they gathered what they needed, and they had very little impact on the environment, and they reacted to the world around them. So they were reactive rather than creative. And so when we can take things like the idea of tattooing, or the idea of ritual that's associated with tattooing, and show that that's being done by forager societies, that's being done by these really ancient people, I think it sort of changes, changes how we view
that's
the past.
far more complex than I think they were giving credence for, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so on the topic of ritual then, and ceremony, and motivations and reasons, roles, responsibilities with the tattooing for these people, where's your information come from that, for that, sorry? Like, are you in discussion with current Indigenous groups and sort of back and forthing and working out what would have been the purpose?
As we can. The tattooing thing is interesting, right? Because again, that was one of those traditions that was stamped out by colonialism. And so depending on which culture you're talking about, there's a rupture of at least several generations where the people that are our generation, they were raised by mothers and grandmothers who were taught to believe that tattooing was, primitive or non-Christian, or, something that they weren't supposed to believe in. And so our generation then is refinding those traditions. And so, at the same time that archaeologists are looking for evidence of this culture, living members of those communities are refinding their own traditions.
Yeah.
And so, if we can all sit down at the table and talk about this, you end up with some really fantastic, cross-pollination of ideas and information and things like that. It's just, it's sometimes hard to get to that spot where you're all sitting at a table. It's hard to get everybody together that way.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's such an interesting area, because I guess the perspectives of the two different parties coming into the discussion are so different as well,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to imagine how they perceived the world back then, you know, their belief systems and the way
Yeah.
that,
Well, and then to be across the table from somebody whose own cultural legacy is telling them that those perceptions were not valid,
yeah,
right? Or that those perceptions weren't right or weren't Christian or weren't whatever they were negative. And so, yeah, there are a lot of cultural hangups. There's a lot of, you know, group dynamics and personal dynamics that you have to come into and get past to do that work.
yeah,
And I think in some cases are more successful than others. You know, there are some indigenous tattooists out there who, you know, rightfully want nothing to do with archaeologists or scholars talking about this topic. If we are Western, they don't want anything to do with us.
yeah.
There are others who are very interested to learn what it is that we may be finding and to, you know, contribute. And both of those paths are completely valid. You just sort of have to learn, you know, very, very slowly and very carefully learn your way through this. We're making this whole thing up as we go along.
Yeah,
right?
I guess
We're
it's how to navigate.
territory here. Yeah.
Yeah, navigate all of the different ways that people are going to receive it and want to interact with it, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So talking about the bundles, you know, this idea of the medicine bundle, can you explain that to people that are listening? I mean, I know a bit about it, but I'd love to hear your view as well. I think it was
Sure.
the book Drawing with Great Needles I was reading.
Yeah. So, you know, historic Native American cultures, well, and even living Native American cultures, a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of Native American bundles, of medicine bundles. You know, it's this small wrapping usually that contains significant objects. And today we tend to think of them as being carried by individuals, you know, a single person's medicine bundle that they carry with them. And it relates to, you know, guardian spirits and how they live their lives and their experiences, sympathetic magic, this sort of thing. Well, going back historically, throughout North America, and particularly on the Great Plains, you find that personal bundles like that are just one small aspect of bundles. And there are these bigger things, these bigger medicine bundles. Sometimes they're war bundles or doctor bundles that are not just associated with an individual, but are associated with like a whole clan or a whole lineage or sometimes an entire tribe.
Yeah.
And these things had agency. They were believed to be created by ancestral and spiritual forces who taught then their ancestors how to make them and how to curate them. You know, the songs that were sung when they were opened, how you perform the rituals that were associated with them.
It's amazing.
And only certain people were allowed to open them. Only trained shaman, because these things were so powerful. Some of these, they talk about the different layers of wrappings and how the things are inside them being the same as how they saw the cosmos as being organized. So when you open one of these things, you were literally peeling apart the layers of the cosmos, right? So that's some heavy stuff, and not just anybody can do it.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
Historically, on the Great Plains, one of those types of bundles was a tattoo bundle. And sometimes they were individual tattoo bundles, and sometimes tattoo bundles were part of these greater sort of great bundles, right? Larger assemblages that had multiple purposes to them. And the reason for that was because, you know, tattooing is, I mean, it's this incredibly powerful force, right? It was being done as people were coming of age. So it's, you know, being tattooed was bringing you through this liminality of being a child and turning you into an adult, right? It's involved in the letting of blood. It was involved with vision quests and fasting.
Yeah.
So there's all of these different things happening at the same time, all of which are really spiritually significant. And so not just anybody could carry or use these bundles. They were carried and used by bundle keepers, by trained tattooists.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the way all that relates then to the archaeological record is, you know, I mentioned earlier about this idea that, you know, people in the past weren't creative or weren't complicated. Well, one of the things we've been recognizing is that there's archaeological evidence of these bundles going back thousands of years. And previous to this, people had seen those groupings of artifacts and just been like, oh, that's a toolkit, right? That's, you know, that's someone's hunting bag that they threw in the grave with them, or they buried over here.
Who's primitive now, right?
Yeah. And now we can look at those and say, you know, these we think are part of that bundle keeping tradition. And so that sort of helps with this identification of things like tattoo tools, because it turns out you're not just looking for pointy things. You're looking for pointy things with pigments and with tools for applying pigments and tools for making pigments and all these different sort of
And I guess,
elements
yeah,
come together.
all the other elements that would have gone with the ceremony, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
The
like even
medicines,
instruments
the
and medicines and herbs. And
musical instruments
have
and
you
ritual accoutrements. Yeah.
have you been privy to seeing any of these ceremonies or rituals firsthand yourself?
I have not. I have
Okay.
not. The tattooing bundles, as far as I'm aware, do not function anymore. The last tattooing bundles were decommissioned or collected by museums and institutions, and sort of in the grand old tradition of like the pith helmet explorers and ethnographers going in and
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
collecting culture, right?
Right.
and and so a lot of those, or a number of those bundles, now reside in museum collections. And there's an interesting thing going on where there are no more bundle keepers who are qualified to maintain tattoo bundles.
Tattoo bundles. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so in many cases, the tribes have made agreements with the museums or with the curating institutions that they don't want them back because no one is qualified to handle them. No one on a spiritual level, no one is qualified to handle them. So they should remain in the institution, but they can't be open, they can't be photographed, they can't be x-rayed. They just have to be curated.
Seems a little strange, that whole concept, though, like museums holding onto their powerful artifacts. Super interesting.
But at the same time, I mean, if you really truly believe in the power of this thing, the liability involved in holding it, if you're not qualified to, is really, really insane, really intense.
Yeah, of course. I've done a bit of work with a shaman in Australia who's of Navajo descent. He unfortunately passed away a couple of weeks ago, but he was a very dear brother and good teacher to myself. And he was the keeper of a bunch of bundles, including some pipes. He was a pipe bearer. And I was lucky enough to sort of see a lot of these things and see him go through some of those processes you're explaining.
Awesome.
of unpacking them in a very methodical and rhythmical nature. It wasn't very like, by a book of instructions like step 1, step 2, even though there was definitely that sort of path to doing it, it was a lot more like a dance, in a way. He sort of knew the steps, he knew the rhythm, and he would do these different things. And he explained to me the significance and the power of a lot of these bundles and these medicines that the people would carry. And, for him, he said holding on to them was important because he knew the power, and if it was in the wrong hands, what could happen, or what maybe could not happen for the people if they didn't have them as well, was a very interesting angle on it,
And that rhythm you mentioned, that was a part of the tattooing process historically. You have these accounts from like the 18 and early 1900s of these tattoo tools oftentimes had rattles or had bells attached to the handles. And so there's this one fantastic account that talks about how, as the tattooing was happening, the shaking of the rattle on the tattoo implement as it went into the skin invoked the movement of the great serpent through the trees.
Yeah.
And it's being accompanied by chanting and songs and drumming. And so it's this whole performative thing that's happening simultaneously. It's not just someone goes in to get a tattoo. It's this whole larger thing that's happening.
Yeah, completely. I've been exploring a lot of that with my own practice, without specifically taking from any cultures, but definitely, I've felt the power of sound in the tattoo process. I mean, you've had tapping done by Durga. Was there anything like that during that process?
Just the sound of the tools themselves.
Just the tools themselves, yeah.
But I think that's so evocative. I mean, even for modern tattooing, right? The buzz of the machine is something that whether you've been tattooed or not, it immediately you cue into what it is.
I was just going to say, even the modern tattoo machine, like once
as you sit for long periods, right? People talk about you're going to fall into that fall into that buzz, fall into that sound. It's this sort of the thing that sort of drone that sort of carries you through it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
with the
totally.
hand tapping, it's the same sonic thing happening, right? It's that constant tapping, that rhythm that's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it was maybe after I started doing things like applying some bells to different hand tools and using the drum and things like that. I started to get into the same state of mind with the machine. So a lot of the
Cool.
tattoos I do are dots. And so when you're dotting, the machine's going bzz, 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 and I'd like end up falling into rhythms with the tattoo machine anyway.
Right
So you're
on.
like getting into a very similar process, but just in a very different way with a different tool.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
well, I mean, the state of mind is one of the most important parts of doing a process like that as well, from my perspective. I'm sure
Yeah.
it'd probably be the same for a lot of these ancient people we're talking about. It's it goes hand in hand with all of their other spiritual pursuits, right?
Well, and if your mind's not clear, I mean, again, these are things that were being done, to initiate people into adulthood, or
Mm.
to, connect them with a guardian spirit, to endow them with, these social honors. Having your head in the game, as we would say today, is really important. You have to live in that moment. And if you're not clear headed, you're not ready to go through it. And I think historically, that's why you see a lot of, for example, fasting traditions, or things like this that accompany those sorts of tattooing, is because
Yeah.
you're sort of clearing the mind and the body of all of these other things, whether it's dietary or whether it's getting yourself into sort of that trance-like state before then undergoing this significant step.
Yeah, right. And then I guess the tattoo would almost put you over that edge, right?
Yep. Yeah. And then when you
Yeah,
come out the
okay.
other side, you are, a man, a woman, you are eligible for certain honors. You are, whatever the purpose of the thing was, you then achieve that goal. And I think, that's tattooing as a rite of passage.
Yeah.
You can't just walk in and walk out. There has to be this thing that you overcome, this sort of, Jacob's ladder that gets you to this elevated place.
Yeah. And I guess tattooing had that place for their cultures because the cultures were spiritually inclined as a priority from the get-go, right? I mean, they
Absolutely.
weren't a materialist culture looking to have careers or do anything like that. It was kind of vision quest from the start to gain direction. Am I sort of correct in saying that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in some cases, that's absolutely what's going on. In other cases, these were marks that you received for, your achievements in battle, or, having hunted certain animals, right? So they commemorated these things that you had done, but then by virtue of having them on your body, they also then gave you certain privileges.
Right.
The ability to sit in a certain spot at the table, or eat the food in a certain order, or marry more than one person, or live in a bigger house, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, like they had this vested interest in acquiring these things, not because they were cool to look at, but because of the social capital that came along with it, and the spiritual capital that came along with it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, that's just such a powerful idea, that your tattoos can give you an authority that's not just this aesthetic quality.
I think it's something we lose in the Instagram era, right?
Yeah, well,
Now
tell me,
I get
tattooing now, tattooing these days, what do you think about it?
I mean, people are doing fantastic work, right? I mean, the level of artistry happening in the industry today is amazing. It's frankly amazing, even compared to when I got my first tattoos 20 years ago. The level and the changes and adaptations and styles and abilities is just amazing.
No
Um,
doubt.
but I think that's a really interesting thing about, like, I don't know, yeah, let's call it the Instagram era, right? Like, I'm going to get this tattoo, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to Instagram it,
Yep.
right? Because why would you get it unless you want to show it to people? Well, historically, and for my stuff personally, it's less about showing it to people than it is about the experience you've gone through to get those pieces. And that includes the experience of sitting with the artist, but the personal journey that gets you there.
Yeah.
So it's not so much about, hey world, look at the new, look at the new thing I got on my arm, and it's more about, hey, I've had 2 kids and I've published a book, and life is really good right now, and I want to have a touch point to remember that by.
Oh, it's so nice hearing that you have that relationship with your tattoos. That's like the backbone of what I'm trying to do with people that come through to get tattooed by myself now. And I think there's definitely a place for it. You see the massive place that it had in the past, and you kind of look at the place that it's, I guess, lacking at the moment. It's much better than it has been for the past 300 years, for sure. I mean, we're having these discussions, so we're probably in a stage of a new sprouting, of this concept where tattoos have a really solid meaning and place and rite of passage for people again. So you mentioned that yours were for having children and writing, publishing a book. You publish more than one book now, right? You got to.
Yeah, so I've
many?
edited 2 books on tattooing now. The first one was Drawing with Great Needles, which is all about Eastern North America, ancient Eastern North America. And then the second one that Lars Krutak and I co-edited is the new one. It's Ancient Ink, the Archaeology of Tattooing. And that's just out last year.
Cool.
And
I
that
haven't seen that yet.
I don't know if you're familiar with Lars's work or not.
I am. I'd love to chat with Lars as well at some point.
Yeah.
I messaged him a few years back, and he got back to me. He was really helpful when I was first, I guess, digging into different avenues of info for my own practice. And he sent me a couple of different contacts, which was good, and that's helped me develop for sure. But I mean, I'm in a very, I guess, more grounded place now.
Yeah, so. Well, I mean, he is such an incredible fountain of information, right? I mean, he knows so much, and so he and I had interacted with each other at a couple of conferences, and he wrote in 2 chapters for Drawing with Great Needles for my first book, and then we started talking about this idea of the archaeology of tattooing. It was something I was sort of looking at, but we knew through our personal connections of other people around the world who were discovering things. And these weren't people that were, they weren't going out looking for tattooing, but they were discovering it as part of the archaeology that they were doing. And so we decided to try to do this book to try to pull in, things from Russia and the Philippines and, the Balkans and these different places into one spot, because otherwise, it's scholarship, right? Otherwise, a lot of this stuff gets lost. It gets lost in journals that most people don't have access to.
So you guys are making a bit of an archaeological tattoo bundle, so to speak, pulling all those loose ends together for us. Yeah, that's good, man. That's really good. That's why I really appreciate what you're doing and what Lars is doing, because for someone like me, I don't have that that academic background. I'm doing the tattoos with people. And so this information is so valuable, especially someone like me, Australian, mixed race, no real genetic pool that tattooing comes from, unless we go way, way back, like you were saying at the start. But I'm feeling like this is the way I need to be working with people, and I'm doing it and getting these responses and seeing in real time, that magic that's there. Right.
Well, and I think that's the incredible thing, on the flip side of the Instagram era, right? The flip side of that global connectivity on the internet is that, I feel like this next generation of scholars really has this idea of, to quote a friend, the rising tide floats all boats, that we're all in it together.
Right.
And, particularly in this era we're in now where, science is really being called into question, right? People just don't believe what academics and what science has to say. Well, if we doing this research don't share it with the public, if we don't get it out there for people to see and to hear about, it doesn't do anybody any good, man, right? I mean, why bother doing it then if we don't get it out there beyond our little clique, our little ivory tower, our little academic journal world? And Lars is the great template for that. His website has so much research and so many of these things that he's written and done hosted there. Yeah. And so that's something, that in my personal stuff, I've been trying to follow that model more and more about, participating in online conversations and putting stuff out where people can find it. Because,
Yeah.
you put something online, Google's going to have a lot more hits on it than like, the journal of something archaeology is, right? A lot
Completely.
more people are going to find it on Google. So yeah, we're trying to spread the love.
Yeah, it's great. And I love that it's science melding with this idea that's so beyond science, that science is catching up with, especially with the Native American cultures. Like we've touched on a couple of times, they've been viewed as primitive in the past, but their understanding was so much more complex and so much deeper. And I think anyone that's shared space with these people or gone through any of their pathways or been lucky enough to see the ceremonies, as soon as you feel that, once you're in physical proximity to that space and the power that it holds, you just go like, yeah, a lot of the stuff that's out there doesn't quite cover the depth and vastness of what's going on. So it's good that you guys are really looking at that, and bridging the science with it and saying, okay, these people were doing these practices and they understood these things that we might not, but here's what we do understand and we can put it together in this way. So
well, and
good
get
work,
it out there
man.
to where, anybody else can, you or anybody else can look at that work then and draw your own conclusions from
Oh
it. And
yeah,
I think
totally,
that's important
man.
too.
Even reading your book about the bundles spun me out. Like I said, I'm not very educated on any of the history and archaeology of any of these groups, and I've had experiences where I'm making bundles, or I've had particular I guess flashes of insight or visions, and then I'll read things documented really well by yourself or by Lars or some other people, and you're just mapping out what I've seen or I've done, and it gives me like a reassurance that the things that are coming through are valid,
Awesome.
So
Well, that's
it's really
awesome,
good,
man. I
man.
appreciate that. Good deal.
So 2 more questions before we wrap this
Yeah.
up. One, what do you predict for our tattoo future?
Oh, well, so I teach a class at Middle Tennessee State University. Every couple of years, they let me teach a class on the anthropology of tattooing,
Wow.
and so I end up with like 35 undergrads kind
I
of
want to
thing.
come. That's
Um,
good.
it's a fun class to teach, but this semester, only about half of the students are tattooed.
Oh, interesting.
And that's been an interesting. So I've been teaching this since 2013, off and on, and yeah, about every 2 years there. And to begin with, right, everybody was tattooed, and that's part of that's the subject of the class. But this year, people aren't, and it's not that people haven't done it. I'd say about a third of the class has made a conscious choice to not be tattooed,
Mm-hmm.
and so that I think is a really interesting shift. And I see that as well with my son, right, who's turning 10 this year. And we've talked about like tattooing and these kind of things, and of course, Dad has tattoos, and at one point I said, do you think you'd get one? And he was like, no, everybody has them. I was like, oh,
Interesting.
all right,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
the 10-year-old perspective right there, right?
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
so I think that's going to be kind of an interesting thing to see shake out, is that now that this thing has become normal. I mean, let's be honest. We're talking about like 40% of Americans that have tattoos right now, right? And even higher than that if you're talking about under 30. So this thing is completely normal. It's not subculture anymore. It is culture. But so
Yes.
what happens then as we move forward? Are people going to become less tattooed? I think that the rise of stick and poke is really interesting, right? The way that people are choosing to forego the tattoo culture and instead to sort of form these really intimate bonds with friends
Yeah.
rather than seek out art. And so
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's an interesting thing that's going to happen too.
I mean, I
I have
think
no
about
idea
that
where
all
it's
the
going to go.
time too. I think about that all the time too, especially like children asking their parents about their tattoos and what's going to make tattooing, I guess, valuable in the next generation's eyes. And, even though tattooing's normal, it is culture now. My perspective is that it's, look, it's been practiced by everyone for a long time and it had immense significance. Then it got
Mm-hmm.
stopped. Then it got picked up and it had a stigma attached to it, right?
Yeah.
That's the past 300 years. Now we've moved out of the stigma. We've washed it clean. Tattooing is normal again, but it doesn't have the same significant value that it had before. So I feel like we're in this stage of like, if we can reinstill the significance of tattooing through our experiences and our stories, and we relay them to the next generation, maybe it'll move into a place where it is culture again, but it's also like a valuable part of it. You know,
we can hope so, right? I think there will always be now a SoundCloud rapper with a tattoo on his face because he got bored one day, right? Like that's apparently a thing that's happening around us.
Yeah,
and I don't think we'll ever reach those guys. But yeah, right. If we can make a difference,
we should start rapping, Aaron. We can do it. We'll reach them.
Not a bit.
Cool. And the other question that I finish the interviews with this, is what's the number one lesson that you've learned from tattooing?
The number one lesson I have learned from tattooing, for me, getting into the archaeology of the thing, we look at people in the past and we talk about the things that people are doing in the past, and we talk about, what they ate or what they believed or this kind of thing. But for me, that's always kind of been distant, because I was talking about, again, cultures that weren't my own. And, people that lived in the past who, it wasn't the same food that they were eating. It wasn't the same, the same context to their lives and beliefs. And for me, this project working on the tattooing has really sort of, I feel in some ways, connected me with these cultures that I study, at least in my own heart, because it really has helped internalize for me this, this is a process that we are not strangers to. Right? It's a continuum, right? Our beliefs and our experiences, they're not separate from one another. They're not different from one another. We all of humanity, right? We all exist on this continuum. And so, whether it's tattooing or whether it's, a faith in a deity or whatever it is, if we can see the world in those terms, right, we're going to get rid of, racism and division and difference and all of these things. And we'll just be bodies. We'll just be humans all in this thing together.
Wow. Love it. That's so good. I'm just picturing everyone with their tattoos out,
with their tattoos out,
geometry all over, and we're just like one tribe. It's so good.
I like it.
Yeah, nice. Cool, man. Thank you so much for having this chat. It's been really insightful for myself. You've got a lot of knowledge. I'm going to have to get my hand on your other book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, no worries. Do you want to go over the titles of your books again for the listeners, and maybe links to your pages and where people can see your work?
Sure. Yeah. So the two books that are out now are Ancient Ink, The Archaeology of Tattooing, which just came out last year through a University of Washington press. And the other one is Drawing with Great Needles, Ancient Tattoo Traditions of North America. And both of those are available on Amazon. Maybe not from your local bookseller, but at least online.
Yeah, great.
And if you Google search me, you'll hit my pages with links to the stuff that I'm doing. And
cool. I'll put them in the description too, so people can follow.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man.
That's great. Cool. And if you're catching up with Lars for a coffee at any point, you could say, "There's this guy who's doing some good podcasts. Maybe look for his email."
And I just say, for whether it's you or your listeners or anybody, man, I mean, again, this is only as good as how far we get it out there to people. Yeah. Right. Like all this knowledge doesn't do me any good. We need to get this stuff out. It's the whole point of it. And so, if you have questions or your listeners have questions, man, look, I'm not hard to find online. Shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions about, ancient tattooing, what it's like to tattoo yourself, where
to get a deer bone,
making bone tools. Actually, I'd like to talk to you at some point about that process of, making hand tools and stuff, and see the sort of things you're doing too.
Totally. I mean, let's get into that. We'll open an email thread. It's very intuitive for me, man. Like I've gone through some pathways like Vision Quest and that type of thing. And so I'm sort of making stuff as directed a lot of the time for people in the moment. And it's a very different process probably. But definitely keen to get into it with you, man, and share some things and show you maybe some photos of stuff that I've made. I blew out after the first couple of tools I made, just, singing, dancing, playing some music, making the tools with what sort of appeared. They looked surprisingly similar to a lot of the stuff I saw in your book,
Yeah.
Don't know what that means, but yeah, we'll definitely share that. But again, thank you very much. I appreciate all the time. You're doing great work. Keep it up. And I'm looking forward to talking to you some more.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Cool. See you, Aaron. Bye. I could definitely keep that up for a few more hours. Aaron, you're going to have to come back sometime in the near future. I've got a whole lot more questions to ask. But in the meantime, if you want to check out his books, read any of the articles, or hit him up with a question, all the links are on my webpage, www.tattooswithintention.com. And if you want to leave me any feedback, please hit me up in the comments thread on the webpage. Thanks, and I'll catch you in episode 3.